All right, so today we're going to be talking about how the British take more steps to control the colonies, but the colonies, of course, do not like that and they resist this control by the British. So we're going to skip around a little bit from what your textbook says. On page 146, you'll see the box, the French and Indian War, and I moved that to the beginning of section 2, entitled "The Colonists Resist Tighter Control," because I thought it would be good to transition with this. So section 1, we just finished talking about the French and Indian War. There were 5 major effects of the French and Indian War. First of all, France lost its North American possessions. As you can see here, this orange part here is French territory before the war. After the war, that is no longer French territory. That is inhabited by Great Britain. Then Britain is also left with a huge debt because it costs a lot of money to fight a war. Colonists fighting together, banding together to fight off the French, they develop a sense of unity. And colonists also began settling in the Ohio River Valley. So that is right around this part right here. Native Americans lived here before that, though. So they are obviously resistant to colonists taking up residence in their home. So they resist the new colonists coming in there. Previously, the French had protected that land for them because they owned that territory. And now the British own it. So now it is being occupied. So one step taken by the Native Americans to resist is called Pontiac's War. This is up in, if you notice, this is Michigan here, the Great Lakes right around here. So we're talking in the upper northern part of the country. So we have modern day New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland. Then we go out a little bit west. This is modern day Michigan. We've got Indiana, Ohio right here. And Pennsylvania, of course. So Britain owned most of that land east of the Mississippi River. And as we mentioned, the Native Americans were still living there. They wanted to keep their land. And the colonists were starting to infringe on their territory and building settlements there. So the leader of the Ottawa Native American nation, Pontiac was his name, he allied with other natives to attack British forts and settlers. And there was a war that lasted for about 3 years between the Native Americans in around modern day Michigan and the colonists in that area. This was, again, the Ohio River Valley as we get a little further south. So there are tensions between natives and colonists. So in reaction to those tensions, the British Parliament passes what's called the Proclamation of 1763. And the Proclamation of 1763 banned all colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. So you can see that line right here. So all of this territory west was no longer open for colonial settlement. They did not want to anger the Native Americans anymore. They did, in fact, though, anger colonists because the colonists said, well, this land has been taken by us legally in the French and Indian War, and it belongs to us. And we are allowed to settle wherever we want. Of course, they did not consider the Native American point of view whatsoever in that assessment because the natives had really been living there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So they didn't really consider that whatsoever, but they did believe that Britain and the colonists legally owned that land, so therefore they should occupy it if they chose to. This and other British laws led to conflict between the British Parliament and King and the colonies. So many of the colonists served in the French and Indian War, but Britain still ruled over them. Because Britain was in debt, they owed so much money. They spent a lot of money on the war. They believed the colonists should help to pay off that debt. After all, the colonies were still British territory. British troops remained in the colonies to defend against the French as well. So there was that physical presence of British soldiers in the territory at that time, which could have certainly been a threat to the colonists. But the colonists viewed them as a threat more and more because they began to identify more as American than British. They viewed the British increasingly as this foreign power who were there just to control them, but didn't really understand what they were, what their life was like, and what they were going through there in the colonies. They were not one of them. Now, to make matters worse, the British started passing Parliament, and the King started passing different taxation acts to help pay the debt back for the French and Indian War. The first one in 1764 was the Sugar Act. Sugar Act taxed molasses and other sweeteners, and it called for harsh punishment of smugglers who would try to get those goods illegally into the colonies to get around the taxation. The Quartering Act. Quartering Act said that British soldiers who lived in the colonies would and could go up to a colonist's home and demand to be quartered there. Basically means that the colonists would have to let them stay there. And not only that, they'd have to supply them with food and other necessary supplies. Colonists viewed this as a violation of their rights. We talked about John Locke, right? Life, liberty, and property. The colonists viewed this as a violation of their right to their own property, and really also it affected their life and liberty too, because they were not free to do what they wanted. They had to house these British soldiers. The Stamp Act, 1765, this one really angered the colonists. It required the colonists buy stamps, tax stamps, for a variety of goods. So your book mentions newspapers, wills, licenses, insurance policies, land titles, contracts, and other documents. Everything you purchased, you had to get a stamp for it. So any kind of document, any sort of, if you bought a newspaper, there would be a stamp on top of that said that this has been purchased legally. You need to pay additional tax of such and such, here in this case, 1 penny. So that's a lot of money back then, though. Penny's worth more then than it is now. So you'd have to pay extra in order to buy that newspaper or to make a contract. You had to pay money to Britain. This really angered the colonists because it took a lot of money out of their pockets. And the House of Burgesses and other local governments or colonial governments went as far as to say that only colonial governments could tax colonists, not the British. In order to protest, the colonists boycotted British goods. A boycott is an organized campaign to refuse to buy certain products. So British ship goods over. The colonists say, we'll not buy anything that is British made. We will only buy things that are made here locally, produced locally in the colonies. Of course, Britain had a lot more manufacturing power, so that was not necessarily an easy thing to do, but they believed it was something that was important to make sure that Britain started to feel the pain of their decisions that they were making and the colonists thought were unfair. The colonists also wrote petitions or written requests to the government of Great Britain. They petitioned Parliament and the King to end the Sugar and Stamp Acts. In 1766, Parliament ended up repealing, which basically means to cancel the Stamp Act, but they also passed what's called the Declaratory Act. It declared that Britain had total control over the colonies. Colonies had no say. So they could basically do whatever they want. Whatever we say, you have to listen to us. The Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts were in 1767. Britain, due to the protests, agreed to no longer tax transactions within the colonies, only when products were imported to the colonies, as we see here in Boston Harbor in the picture. Sounds like a good thing, but it also provided for something called writs of assistance. A writ of assistance meant that an official could use a court order to search a person or their property without giving any reason. So basically, somebody could come into your house and search it, and a British soldier could, for instance, and they did not have to give any reason to search your property. Now, this is something that led to later the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, which gives people the right to be secure in their house, their papers, their effects. They cannot be searched without any sort of real just reason. It protected the colonists, then the Americans, against unreasonable searches and seizures. And you needed a warrant or probable cause to search someone. So this later on inspired that Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. Next, one of the major, most famous events in the road to the Revolution was the Boston Massacre. So these boycotts are going on in Boston, and in 1770, a group of angry Bostonians surrounded a group of British soldiers in Boston. And remember, the British soldiers were still occupying colonial America, and there were a lot of them in Boston too, because Boston was a major shipping port. The soldiers were there to make sure that British goods were able to get safely onto the docks and then distributed. They enforced order there. There were many British soldiers still living within the city of Boston, even though it was a colonial city. So these angry Bostonians had a lot of pent-up frustration against the British. They saw these soldiers there, and they decide, well, we're going to throw some snowballs and rocks at them, because they were just getting their frustration out. Of course, that's something that would not be responded to well by the soldiers. So the soldiers fired back into the crowd, and that caused what's called the Boston Massacre. 5 people were killed and 6 were wounded. Now, of course, if we hear the word massacre, we think of a very serious, widespread mass killing, which this was not necessarily the case. Perhaps the details were embellished a little bit to make it sound worse than it really was. The colonists wanted to make sure that this was viewed as something that was that could not be accepted and tolerated. Of course, it was not a good thing that these 5 people were killed, but they wanted to make it sound as bad as possible, like these British soldiers were did something that was completely horrible and horrifying and must be punished for it. Of course, the Bostonians are the ones who started that. So they made the first move. However, of course, the British responded with excessive force in firing on them. Now, 2 of the soldiers, only 2 of them were convicted for killing the 5 colonists, which angered more colonists as well, because they wanted more of them held responsible for what happened. Now, so there's a lot that's going on now in the colonies. There's more and more frustration being built up against British rule. So just as a way to keep the colonies informed, there was a communication system that developed amongst the colonists. That was called the Committees of Correspondence, and Samuel Adams was responsible for that, an early colonist. He established the Committee of Correspondence, the first of the Committees of Correspondence, and there were others that sprung up after his as well. And basically, they served the purpose to circulate letters and pamphlets that just let the colonists know, hey, here is what's going on. Here's what the British are doing, just so everyone was aware of it. It was a way to unify the colonies. And obviously, if you're passing notes around amongst yourselves that you were keeping a secret, basically they were gossiping about the British in this way. So they were keeping the British out of it. So it's basically unifying the colonists against the British, the Committees of Correspondence. And that's all we have for today. So please fill in any notes that you missed from reading the book, and we'll see you next time.